You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Welcome back to Refocused Radio. Once again, we are here today, and just like any other time, we have another amazing show lined up for y'all today. This time we are talking to a special guest, a compelling storyteller, a speaker, and he is also a podcast host himself. He has a show, When You Look. We're talking to the one and only Mick Wienholt. He is going to share with us his amazing stories. He has two powerful turning points, if you will, and we're going to get deeper into that with his personal story. But I just want to rush to the quick to the chase, if you will, and bring him on the show because I could spend another 5 minutes on his details of his bio. And just welcome, first of all, Mick. Thank you for being on the show today. How are you doing, man?
Oh, Shemai, I'm doing great, man. Thanks a bunch for having me on.
Yes, sir. I said it in the beginning. You have two really impactful turning points in your life that comes from deep grief, but it also it gives you renewed hope and inspiration. So for our audience, explain the two stories in your life that made you end up having some deep grief in your life.
Yeah, man. So I'll take everybody back to November 7th of 2000 for the first story in this episode. And for most of us, that won't mean anything until I say it was the day of the hanging Chad. So some listeners out there will remember that Al Gore, George W. Bush, it's National Election Day, and it's the day of the hanging Chad, which was just otherwise a regular old Tuesday. And for me, I was 19 years old. I'm originally from Baltimore, and I'd been living in the greater Denver and Boulder area of Colorado for about a year. And Shemaya, I'm just completely fueled by ego and by Mountain Dew. And so I decided that I'm going to go climb, not hike, but I'm going to go climb a 14,000 foot peak. And so I decided that I was going to go climb Gray's Peak, which is one of the closer peaks to Denver. And I was intent on climbing up this snow gully, or a snow couloir, as they call them. To think of it just sort of like the chute at the top of a ski resort that, you know, the best skiers would ski down, essentially. Okay, so I'm climbing up this narrow chute of snow, and I'm about 200 or 300 vertical feet up this actual climb, which puts me at right around 13,000 feet. And because it's early season, meaning it's November, it's not yet even winter officially, of course, there's snow everywhere, and that's what I'm climbing, but the snow hasn't accumulated enough over the months of winter conditions for the snow to be stable. And so as I'm ascending it, I end up disturbing the snow too much, and I literally trigger an avalanche. And I can distinctly remember hearing the whoomp sound that sort of lets you know that all of the snow is settling. And then I looked up, and I could see the fracture line, and I could immediately see the snow coming towards me. And so I did my best with my, ego and my logic to outrun this thing. And so I turned to my left with the intention of being able to kind of move perpendicular to the sliding snow. And I got one step to my left, and I was swept off my feet. And Shemaya, as I was swept off my feet, I literally remember thinking to myself, this is going to suck for my family, especially my mom. And then the lights went out.
I can't imagine that. I mean, I can kind of get a little theater in my mind, but I mean, kind of paint the picture for our audience moments after. I mean, what was going through your head?
Yeah, so I'm immediately knocked unconscious. And so at that point, to your question, nothing's really going through my head, which turns out to be, I think, a wonderful blessing. So some period of elapsed time occurs, and I regain consciousness, and I'm at the bottom. But now I mentioned before that I was 200 or 300 vertical feet up this slope. I'm basically back down to where I was, and I'm not buried. I'm literally not buried by the snow. And despite bouncing my way down, and I'll explain my injuries in a moment. I'm not mangled in any way, or you know what I mean? I'm not like my arm wasn't tucked under me in some weird way. And I was literally sitting on a rock. And so I sat up and kind of shook things off, and then did this systems check. And it seemed like everything was a go. And that really, Shemaiah, became the operative word. I had this sense that I was in danger and that I needed to go. So what I did at that point was I immediately set out to get back to the trailhead parking lot, which was about 3 miles from the actual base of the climb. And the reason I led in with the election day and it being a Tuesday is because it's totally normal for lots and lots of people to be in the mountains, particularly up at Gray's Peak on a warm weekend day. But this is middle of the week in snowy winter conditions. And so there's nobody there. And your listeners have probably figured out at this point, I'm climbing by myself. So I'm completely alone. And I hike then the 2.93 miles back to the trailhead parking lot. And 30 seconds before I walked into that trailhead parking lot, a complete stranger, his name is Steve, I didn't know that at the time, arrived in the parking lot. And so he says to me as I'm walking into the parking lot, "What happened to you?" And I very matter-of-factly said, "I was in an avalanche." And I walked right past him, intent on getting in my Toyota pickup truck and driving myself to the hospital. Well, to make a long story short, because I had suffered pretty significant trauma to my head during the avalanche, I was in no shape to even actually take my jacket off. So I literally had to ask this complete stranger to help me take my kind of like Gore-Tex rain jacket, shell jacket off. And the reason I couldn't get it off, just so that everybody has some understanding of how bad things were, is that there had been so much blood that had been dripping from my mouth and my head onto my chest. And because of the cold conditions, it had actually frozen. Wow. So I couldn't literally get my zipper down through all of the junk that had frozen on the jacket. And so I had to ask this complete stranger to help me even get my jacket off. And it was at that point, there were a few other pieces involved in that I realized I need to let this guy take me to the hospital, because he had been campaigning with me over a handful of moments to say, "Hey, you're not in good shape. Let me take you to the hospital." And my ego said, no. And so my mouth said, no. And then I couldn't get the jacket off. And so I finally relented.
Wow. So that's good right there.
Yeah. So he took me to the hospital, and all the King's men basically put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But the extent of those injuries were that my skull was fractured in 3 places. My jaw was broken on both sides, and my scalp was split from just over top of my right eyebrow all the way to the top of my head, right at the back where your head starts to curve down towards your neck. So it was like roughly an 11-inch long split in my scalp. And so Steve described, he said, when we took your jacket off, and I had my hood up at that point, my hood around my face, he said, for all intents and purposes, your right ear was sitting on your right shoulder. I mean, that's how bad it was. So the trauma to my brain ultimately ended up resulting in bleeding on my brain and swelling of my brain. And so they did emergency brain surgery on me sometime very late the night of November 7th or very, very early in the morning of November 8th. And so I awakened in the hospital on November 8th with my vision obscured. Not blurred, but obscured. And the reason for that was just like we've all seen in the movies and in TV when someone has, the brain injury or the head injury or they're shot in the face or something like that. I literally had gauze wrapped around my head, and it was the corner of my eyes that were covered in the gauze that was obscuring the vision. And it was at that point that they told me, yeah, you had brain surgery last night.
Wow. Yeah, that's one heck of a story. I mean, first and foremost, I'm glad you're here talking to us today. That's the first thing. And two, having to experience that is a wild thing to experience. What was the process like? And by the way, listen to Refocused Radio, watching us online and talking to our guest today, Mick Wienholt. Talk to us. What was it like after you started to begin the recovery process? I mean, I can imagine that was a very long road.
Yeah, well, man, by God's grace, it turned out to be a pretty short recovery in a lot of ways, or at least maybe the visible ones. So I was out of school and out of the workforce for a total of 3 weeks. And that was after 6 total days in the hospital. And then I was back into the workforce. And, I did my best to try to wrap my head around all of it, but I didn't have a lot of maturity as a 19-year-old to really understand the gravity and kind of the depth of what had happened. Meaning, I knew that it was a miracle that I was saved. And by that, one, I wasn't buried. And two, this stranger named Steve is just there. So I gave God, and I had no relationship with God. In fact, I was at a point in my life where I very much hated God, wanted to be at the greatest possible distance away from God as I could be. But I still gave him intellectual credit that it was just this miracle, because I really did not understand much more beyond that. And my mother, at certain points over the years subsequent, she would say to me, God saved you for a reason. Why was that? And I just didn't even have a response for that even later in life. Now, subsequently, I have, which has been great, but it really ultimately was another dozen years after this that I entered into a relationship with God. And that was as a result of kind of the second scenario that we were planning to talk through.
I mean, you have another story I'm sure we'll get into, but later in life, you end up starting a family. Tell us about that process. And also, I can imagine you had a career or, a job that you were working at. So kind of paint the picture of what's going on later in life.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so we were 19 in our initial story here, and so everybody should fast forward 12 years now. This is late 2010 into the beginning of 2011, and I'm now 30 and 31 years old. And I exactly as you were saying, I was climbing the corporate ladder. My wife and I had now been married for a handful of years. We've been married without children, and I am still, Shemaiah, fueled by ego. And in this case, because I make a few more bucks and I'm not the super broke college kid that I was before, it's now Red Bull as my drink of choice, not Mountain Dew. And so we decide that we're going to get pregnant and start a family. And I say it that way because we thought it was our decision. You know what I mean? And again, that's the ego. So we were blessed, even though we would have never used that word then, we were blessed to get pregnant immediately. And we know plenty of families and folks that don't have that blessing. We got pregnant. Everything seemed to be going really, really, really well with the pregnancy. And a week before our baby is due, and we were due with a son, I come back from walking our dogs. My wife is standing in the kitchen and she's crying. And I said to her, "Hey, honey, what's up?" And she says, "I haven't felt him move since last night." So we go to labor and delivery at the hospital that we were scheduled to deliver at. They moved us into not a normal delivery room, but this smaller side room. And the ultrasound techs began to check for a heartbeat. First one couldn't find one. Second tech, second machine, can't find one. And then they bring in the MD to basically attempt to work his magic, but we knew ultimately what he was about to tell us. And then he ended up saying, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your baby no longer has a heartbeat." So here we are. This is the beginning of 2012. This is January 4th of 2012. We're exactly 1 week from our son's due date, which means he's full term. He's 39 weeks gestationally. And we find out that he has died in utero. And so my wife is induced. And the following day, because it takes a number of hours for all of that induction medicine to begin its process, and then you have labor and all of that. So the following day, my wife delivers a 6-pound, 8-ounce, 21-inch long dead baby, our son named Luke. But it was ultimately, Shemaiah, at the moment when we found out that Luke was dead, that I grappled with and was really confronted with something I had never encountered in my entire life. And what I mean by that is up to that point as a 31-year-old, I had been very much a capable person, successful in the workforce and able to overcome challenges there, a capable athlete, and everything that we did around the home or with a car repair, almost always I took care of that with a little bit of help, maybe from a friend or a DIY type of video. And my point in all of this was that up to that point in life, I had this belief, this perception, ultimately a misunderstanding, that I was capable of overcoming anything. And what ended up happening is here I was confronted with the reality, knowing I cannot fix a dead baby. And so as a result of that, I knew it was beyond me. And that God that I talked about earlier that I hated and wanted nothing to do with, I cried out to him, literally on my knees. And I was on my knees, not in a position of spiritual surrender. I was on my knees, literally on the hospital floor from the weight, the physical weight of the emotion of the grief of finding out that our son was dead. And so I cried out and I said, I need you. And he met me there. And what he ended up showing us, Shemaiah, us meaning my wife as well, was that what we thought was a Luke-shaped hole in our hearts, meaning our son's, name. We thought there was this Luke-shaped hole. And through the grief and the way God healed us through the grief, he showed us you didn't have a Luke-shaped hole. You had a God-shaped hole in your heart. And so it's been amazing how over the last 14 years that he has loved us and guided our lives and done all kinds of amazing things. And then later redeemed Luke's death.
Once again, wow. Listen, on Refocused Radio, we don't always have super heavy stories like that, but man, that's pretty heavy. You listen on Refocused Radio, watching us online, talking to our guest today, Mike Wienholt. When you think about, you have a podcast show let's talk about that real quick before we sign off, because time is melting like ice on the hot stove. You're host of the podcast show. When you look, did anything in these situations that you experience in life inspire you to say, you know what, I need to do something special, like a special project? And if so, how were you inspired to launch your own show?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity just to chat a bit about that. So at the beginning of 2025, I was moving from one company to another. I was a career guy, sales guy, SVP of sales, and the transition from company A to company B completely imploded. And it was crystal clear to my wife and I that this was God that was doing this, because all of that stuff, especially at those higher levels, is reviewed by one legal team after another. And we knew that this was God. So I went into a fast, and I'd never fasted for any spiritual reason before. I'd done plenty of fasting for health purposes, but never spiritual fast. And I went into a 3-day fast. And on the third day of that fast, God told me to not look for work, which is, of course, totally countercultural. And he told me to focus on when you look, which had really been a bit of in the mix, in the idea stage for varying degrees. But as long back as 2020, And so he said, this is what I want you to do. And so that was launched, and we've recorded more than 100 episodes, and they're ordinary people sharing a firsthand extraordinary experience. And then we let the listener decide, hey, was that crazy thing that this person just shared, was that coincidence or was that God? And what is incredible is the amazing aspects of the stories. I mean, we got a guy here who is we'll call him a professional partier, lives in Vegas, has been there for years, knows how to do everything, okay, in terms of drugs, alcohol, etc. He's in the midst of his third OD, and he just simply wants to die because he's been convulsing on his living room floor right on the strip in his condo for 3 straight days. And his hope is that he will die. And he cries out and says the name of Jesus and is instantly delivered from the convulsions. And moments after that is able to stand up and essentially is sober. And it's like one type of incredible story after another where someone could say, hey, that was coincidence, and others could say that was miraculous. And we hold space for both of those, sort of decisions and beliefs based on what people have heard. It's pretty wild.
Man, this whole interview was pretty wild, to say the least. Listen to Refocused Radio, watching us online, talking to our guest today, Mick Wienholt. You can go to his website, whenyouluck.com. Again, that's whenyouluck.com. Man, Mick, I'm telling you, I can't believe this show is almost over. But someone who's watching and listening to us right now, let's just face it. Everyone faces their own personal battles, right? We can't judge, who has it worse than whoever, because everyone's story is unique and situation is unique. If someone feels like they're just overwhelmed with life right now, I mean, man, all they got to do is look at your story and say, man, this guy can have a smile on his face on a podcast show, radio show, then what am I talking about? What would you say to them that helped you personally when you was going through these hard seasons in your life? You could easily been sad and mad and complain, but you're here, you're doing great things. What kept you motivated?
Yeah, well, man, thanks a bunch for asking it that way, because I'll just speak from my personal experience. I have been to some really, really desperately low spots. And they may look a tiny bit different than the person that's listening, but low is low. Rock bottom is rock bottom. And what I found from my own experience was even this God that I didn't know and frankly hated for a lot of my life, when I got to my rock bottom, I cried out to that person. I cried out to that being, and that God met me. And what I experienced then was a desire to just dump my heart out to that person. And what I mean by that was I was angry with God. I was sad with God. I've been happy with God. And even in my whitest hot, fiery rage, because I'm just so pissed at God, as I've dumped my heart out to him, he's handled every bit of it, and he's loved me in that process. So from my experience, I would encourage anybody that is in that spot today to cry out, let him have it, dump the truck, open up your heart, shout at him, and if you need to use 4-letter words, he can handle it. That's been my experience.
People don't really understand what other people go through unless they look at a little chapter 1 or a little demo teaser of their life movie. And just hearing what you share with us today, man, you are definitely a strong human being, one. And I know I'm not going to speak for you, I'll let you speak, but I can imagine this has something to do with your faith. And let's touch on that before we sign off. How have you been able to rely on your faith, if that's the case, to be strong?
Yeah. Well, I think the best way for me to answer that is that my faith has grown over the years, and it's grown because I've just had more time with God and more experience in the relationship with him. And then there's one other element that's really tangible. And so I offer this up as encouragement. I began to recall all of the times in my life that God was really present, or that he did something that was very tangible. And we began to capture those, and we actually put a wall up in our house called the Miracle Wall. And it's just got a bunch of push pins on it. And it's just simple things like this prayer was answered or this thing happened. And the reason why we did that was it became visible. It became visible to us as we would just simply walk by it as a continual reminder that even though things are challenging, tough, bad, look at all of what we have as evidence of God seeing us through these other things. We believe he will see us through this where we're at now.
Well, speaking of a reminder, if you've been inspired by Mick's story, make sure you go check out his website, whenyoulook.com. And man, been talking to Mick Wienholt, like always. Wow, you had me speechless. I didn't have to ask you too many questions because I was eating popcorn, and watching, listening to this movie that you illustrated for our audience. So, like always, Mick, thank you for sharing your strength and your truth. And like always, thank you for your time.
Man, Shemaiah, thanks a bunch, man. You're an awesome host and really appreciate it.